Hey, how's it going guys? My name is Dom and today I'm going to be showing you how to build this avoider game using HTML, CSS and of course JavaScript. Okay, so the objective of this game right here is going to be to dodge those red enemies as they drop down from the top. So your role as the player is going to be to use the left and right buttons on your keyboard to of course avoid those enemies. So really straightforward. Now as your score increases, so will the speed at which the enemies are going to drop down. So basically, this game is going to get progressively harder. Now, the way you lose is, of course, if you manage to not avoid the enemy just like that, and it tells you your score, and if you press OK, it's going to restart the game. So really straightforward in how it works, and the code is also going to be really simple, okay? So it's going to be perfect for you guys who are just starting out to learn JavaScript, because of course the code inside here is going to contain no external libraries or frameworks, nothing fancy, just really straightforward JavaScript code. Okay, so with that being said, the source code for this is going to be linked down below in the description if you want to, download it and follow along while you watch today's video. Okay, so going inside this tab right here, let's begin from scratch to create what I just showed you. Okay, so going inside the text editor, I've got this index.html file. So the first step is going to be to create a CSS and a JavaScript file. Okay, so going inside the sidebar here, let's make a new directory called source. Okay, inside here, let's make a new file called main.css, and the same goes for another file called main.js. Okay, so of course these two files are going to be your CSS and your JavaScript file respectively. Okay, so now we can link up these two files by going back inside the index.html, going inside the head tag. Then we can simply drop down and we can make a new link to a CSS file, of course, going to src/main.css. We can do the exact same thing for the JavaScript file. So we can say script source going to src/main.js. Now, it's going to be very important that you use the defer attribute right up here. And this is going to ensure that the JavaScript code which you write inside this main.js is only going to be executed once the document has been fully loaded by the JavaScript. So if you don't include this defer attribute here, you might run into random issues, things like undefined element or node and things like that. So make sure you have your defer attribute set right there. Okay, so now when it comes to the HTML for the avoider game, basically it's going to work like a grid. Okay, so if I go back inside the example, we have a header up the top here which contains the score, and we also have the bottom section here which contains a grid. Okay, so there are basically a total of 33 cells inside this grid, so it's going to be a 3x11 grid. Now, of course, the bottom 3 cells or the bottom row is reserved for the player, whereas the top 30 or the top 10 rows are reserved for the enemies. Okay, so we need to, of course, represent that inside the HTML. Okay, so if I go back inside the text editor, let's create a new div with a class of header, which is also going to contain the score. So we'll say score, then say colon, then specify a strong tag here and just say 0 by default. So now if I save this and go back in the browser, we're going to get something like that. Okay, so now let's move on to creating that 3x11 grid. So going back inside the text editor, let's make a new div with a class of grid, and then inside here we can simply specify all of our 33 different cells. So we'll say div with a class of cell, and then we can simply duplicate this 33 times. So we can make 3 copies of the cell right there, and then simply copy this another 10 times. So the keyboard shortcut for this is going to be Shift, Alt, and down in VS Code. So I'll just say drop down, that's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 to give us a total of 33 cells. Okay, so now if I save this and go back inside the browser, we get nothing because of course those cells don't contain any information. So we need to use CSS to actually visualize these cells. Okay, so if we go inside the CSS file right up here, let's firstly just make the background dark. So we'll say body, then we can simply just say a background of #333 just like that for a dark gray. We can now specify the class of header, and for this one, let's give this a padding bottom of 5px just to create some space between the score and the actual, main grid. We can also give this a color of white and a font family of sans serif. Okay, if I save this and go back in the browser, we get something like that. Okay, so now going back inside the text editor, let's now target the class of grid. So for the entire grid, we're going to actually use a CSS grid to help us display those cells. So we can say display as a grid right here. Now, with the display of grid, it's basically going to allow us to now specify how each column should look like. So we'll say down here, grid template columns, then say repeat 3 at 30px. Okay, so we're just saying right here, give us 3 columns of 30px inside the grid. Okay, so if you're confused about CSS grid, I've got a whole video dedicated to explaining how that works, but basically for the purposes of this tutorial right here, this just means give us 3 columns of 30px in width. Okay, then we can simply specify some padding on the entire grid itself. We can just say 20 pixels around the edges. We can give this a gap of 5 pixels. This right here is going to give us 5 pixels of space between every single cell. Okay, so this right here is going to be made a lot clearer once we actually see the cells in action. But for now, let's keep that right there. We can also give this a border of 1 pixel, solid, and then CCC for a light gray border, as well as a darker background of 222. Okay, so I'm going to save this right here and go back in the browser. As we can see, we've got a couple of changes to the grid right there. Now, as we can see, the grid is taking up the entire width of the screen. So in order to fix that, we need to instead give this a display of inline dash grid. So now it is only going to take up as much space as it needs to, and we can see right there, it's giving us those 3 columns of 30 pixels. Now, to better help visualize what those look like, we're going to drop down here and we're going to be targeting the cell class. So for the cell class, we can give this a height of 30px. So give it the same height as you did for the column width. That way it's a perfect square. So if I save this and go back in the browser, we now have our grid. Now, how do we visualize this grid? If I go to inspect element right up here, and we can see that we have each of the grid items displayed right there. In the green, we've got our 20 pixels of padding. Between each square there, that purple striped area, that is our grid gap of 5 pixels, okay? So that is our grid being displayed. Now, you can obviously change these values. For example, I might want to change the padding to be 5 pixels because I think 20 is too much. So let's change that right there. And we can see now we get something like that. So totally up to you guys and what you want to do. All right, so that is our grid. Now, let's explore displaying the enemies and the players on the actual, board. Okay, so for that, we need to create a couple of classes. So let's actually go back in the index.html, and we're going to be positioning an enemy in the 3rd cell. So just for examples purpose, or just for demonstration purposes, let's drop down into the 3rd cell here. We can make a new div with a class of enemy. So now we can even copy this a few more times. So we can just put it right down here and just see what it looks like. So with the class of enemy here, we're just going to be using CSS to make this have a red background and make it take up the entire width and height of the actual cell. So the same goes for the player. So dropping down to one of the last 3 cells, let's drop it inside the second last cell and make this a class of player. So now we have a player div and 2 enemies being displayed inside the grid. Okay, I may have said player grid before, but you know what I mean. We have a player and then two enemies. So going back inside the main.css, let's target the class of player. Let's actually target the class of enemy, then put a comma and then say player. So for both the enemy and the player, we're going to be assigning a width of 100% and a height of 100%. Okay, and we can leave it right there just for now. We can also target the enemy explicitly, and we can set a background color of, it is going to be F31414 for that grid, which I used in the example. We can just duplicate this line as well, and this time targeting the player, we can change the background to be 14C6 and then F3, so giving us that light blue. So now if I save this and go back in the browser, we're going to get something like that. As we can see, we have every single, well, not every single, but we have those two enemies right there and the player on the bottom. Okay, so now you may want to make these circles just like the example back inside here. So to make those circles, let's drop back inside the text editor and we can apply a border dash radius here of 50%. So to be honest, it probably looks a bit better with them being squares, but it's up to you guys, obviously. I think if you're going to be using circles, it might be best to increase your padding on the grid to be something like 20px, just like I showed in my example, and you get something like that. All right, so that is the main HTML and the CSS complete. So now we can move on to the JavaScript for the Avoider game. Okay, so when it comes to the JavaScript for the Avoider game, let's go inside the main.js file right inside here, and we can begin by defining a few constants and variables before moving on to the main code for the game itself. Okay, so inside the main.js, let's define a new constant called cells, and this right here is going to be an array containing each one of our 33 cells, both the enemy and the player cells. So we can go inside here and we can say array.from, then we can pass in here document.query selector all, then pass in here the class of cell. So now if I console.log the cells array, then go back in the browser, we're going to get something like this. As we can see, we get each one of our 33 cells represented inside the JavaScript. Okay, so now we need to simply split up this array into two different arrays for the enemy and the player cells. So going up here, we can just say const enemy cells equal to, then say cells.slice. So inside the slice method, we can simply say 0 and then 30. So we're just saying, look, we have the cells, we're going to select the cells the elements between index 0 and index 30. This is going to simply just give us the first 30 cells. So now if I console.log the enemy cells, go back in the browser, we get 30 cells right here, and it's going to stop once we reach the bottom, of course, the last enemy cell. Okay, we can now go back inside here, do the exact same thing for the player cells. This time we can just say const player cells equal to cells.slice, then say 30 and then infinity by providing no extra argument here. So now it's going to be cell 30 and beyond, cell 31 and beyond. So going back inside here, and we can just log out the results of player cells, and we can see we get those three bottom cells right there. So we have the player cells and the enemy cells split out. We can now make a new constant called score display equal to, then we can just say inside here document.query selector, then pass in the class of score. So what does this score class mean? Well, going back in the index.html, we need to actually add a class to the strong element inside the header for the score, just like that. So now it's going to be, retrieved by the JavaScript. So back inside here, score display simply references this strong tag in the HTML. So now we can specify a couple more variables which contain information about the current state of the game. So going down here, we can just say let's drop count. Then we can say speed and then score. So what are these three variables right here? The drop count is simply just the amount of times that essentially the board has been pushed downwards. So if I go back in the example and I start playing the game, that's one drop count, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. So that is your drop count. And we're going to be updating that as we continue, of course, playing the game. Now, the speed is just the speed of the game in milliseconds. So it starts at 1,000, as we'll see shortly. And the score is simply just the player's score. Okay, so now let's get the actual, keyboard working with the left and right arrow keys. So for this, we can just say document.addEventListener for the key down event. So basically, this is going to fire off whenever the user presses a key on the keyboard. It can be any key, not just left and right, but of course we need to check what key it is in the function. So we can grab onto the event object right inside here, specified by the E. So now that E is going to contain essentially what key the user has pressed. But before doing that, let's make a new constant inside here called player. This is going to be equal to the player object. So basically that blue circle. For this, we can simply say document.query selector, then pass in here the class of player. So now, of course, the class of player right down here inside this parent cell, is of course what the player means in the JavaScript right inside here. So I've got that reference to the player object. So now, if we drop down here, let's check for which key was pressed. So we can say if e.key is equal to arrow right. So if the user pressed on the right arrow key, then we can do something. Okay, so for this, in order to move the player to the next cell, we can simply say player.parentElement.nextElementSibling. Now, I might just minimize the sidebar here. We're saying nextElementSibling.appendChild. Okay, then we'll say player. So basically, what's happening is we're starting at the player. So going back on the index.html, we're starting at the player div right here. We're then saying get me the parent element. This right here gives you the containing cell. In this case, it's going to be this cell here on line 51. This is your parent element or your cell. Next, we're saying from that cell, give us the next element sibling. The next element sibling is the next cell on line 54. We're then saying from that cell, append the child of the player. Of course, append child is going to, in this case, it's going to move the player div from this one down into the next one. Okay, that's what that's doing. So now if I save this and go back in the browser and I press the right button on my keyboard, that happens right down there. It moves to the next cell. Let's do the exact same thing this time for the arrow left. So let's copy this down and we'll say arrow left, then just say previous element sibling instead of the next element sibling, and do the exact same thing. Back in the browser, press left, it goes that way, press right, it goes that way, and then so on. Now, here's the problem. If I go back again, it goes up there. Okay, so that's obviously not right. So the same thing goes for the right key. It simply just has an error if you want to go right off the grid. So to avoid these two issues right here, let's go back in the code and we're going to have another check inside our if condition here. So we'll say if the user's trying to press the right arrow key and the target cell is one of the player cells. Okay, so we'll just say right inside here, player cells dot includes. Then we can just say player dot parent element dot next element sibling. So remember, this next element sibling is simply just the next cell. If that next cell is part of the player cells, so player cells.includes, we're good to go. We can do the exact same thing right below, this time for the, once again, previous element sibling instead. I can save this and go back in the browser. I can press left and then again, and the problem is gone. Same goes for the right, the problem is gone. So that is our code right there for, when the user presses the key on their keyboard. Next up, we're going to simply define a function called reset. So for this reset function, basically, it's going to reset the game to its default values. Okay, so this means it's going to set all of this stuff up here back to its default, state. So down here, we can just simply say drop count equal to 0 by default. We can say the speed is going to be equal to 1000 milliseconds or 1 second by default. And the score is going to be 0 by default. Now, when it comes to the HTML score display up here, we need to also reset that number just in case the user has previously played a game. So we can just say score display.innerHTML equal to then an empty, or not an empty string, but just a string containing a 0. So of course, just setting that score display right there. Now, when it comes to the reset function, we need to also reset the player and make them be positioned in the center of the last row. With that being said, we may as well also clear the board of all of the existing enemies. So if I go back inside the example here, we have these 5 enemies on the board. When I press OK, that reset code is actually ran. And we can see it's cleared up all of the board and put the player back in the center. So let's go back inside here and make that happen. To achieve that, we can simply just say cells.forEach. So for every single cell on the board, we can just say cell, then say cell.innerHTML equal to an empty string. So just simply clearing out every single cell, including the player cell. So now, if I call the reset function directly, when the page first loads up and go back in the browser, we get nothing on the grid. So our default, enemies and circles from the HTML have been deleted. So all of these ones right here. That being said, we may as well also just remove those enemies because we don't need them right now. These enemies are going to be done by the JavaScript, and the same goes for the player. So let's remove this player on the bottom because, like I just said, the JavaScript is going to be inserting those instead. So with that being said, going back inside the JavaScript code, let's drop down under the clear line of code here, and we can just say player cells at index 1, so the middle player cell. And we'll just say .innerHTML equal to, then we can just pass through here a new div with a class of player. Okay, so just simply specifying that player in the second player cell. Back in the browser, we get the blue player right down there. So that is our reset method, or function, should I say, defined. Okay, so we can now move on to having some code which is going to basically start the game. So let's make a new function here called start game. So inside this function, we're going to call the reset function. So of course, when you start a new game, you want to be resetting the current states, the score, the drop count, the speed. You want to clear the board, etc. Okay, we can also just say console.log and we can say starting new game just for temporary purposes. Okay, then if I go up here, I can now call the start game function. Go back in the browser, we can see in the console, we see starting new game, and all of our stuff is going to display a 0 score in the center and so on. But the problem is, we don't want the game to start straight away. So back in the example, we can see here, the game isn't currently running. the game only starts when I first press an arrow key on the keyboard, then it starts going down. So to achieve that, if we go back inside the code, let's just go up inside our, key down event listener, and we'll just say, you know what, if there is no current drop count, okay, then we can just say start game, and then we can simply put the reset above here instead. So when the page first loads up, let's reset everything. Then if the user presses a key, let's start the game. Let's save this, go back in the browser, press any key on the keyboard, and we're starting the new game. So when this starting new game, console log runs, this is where we now want the loop to begin, which is going to make those enemies drop down. So when I say loop, I literally mean a constant loop of, your enemies appearing and things like that. So this loop needs to also check if there's been a collision, if you've, hit the cell and whatnot. Okay, so when it comes to this loop, we can go down here. We can make a new function called loop. Okay, so basically this start game function is going to then call the loop function down here. Now, the loop function has to do a couple of things, like I just mentioned, things like collision checking and making those new enemies appear. So inside the loop function, we're going to declare a variable called stop game equal to false by default. So this stop game right here is going to be true if there is a collision. So we're going to be adding adding collision code shortly, but just for now, let's have that variable right there. And then dropping down at the end of the loop. So basically, at the end of every single iteration of, an enemy dropping down, we have to check if the game should be stopped if there was a collision. So we'll say if yes, we're going to stop the game. If the collision was found, if the player has lost, we can just say alert, and we can just say something like your score, then append the current score. Then we'll just say dot, and then say close this window to play again. So this right here is if the player has collided and has lost the game. We can then just call the reset function because like I just showed you in some of the examples, once you close that window, it's going to reset the game back to its initial, state. Okay. If the game can continue, if the player has not yet lost the game, we can simply increase the drop count by 1. So drop count plus plus. We can also recall the loop function. Okay, so we'll just say here, set timeout, and we'll say loop, then pass in the current speed. So once the loop function has finished executing, and we can continue playing, the player has not yet lost. Okay, we're continuing to play. We're going to increase the drop count, and then we're going to recall the loop at the specified speed. So in this case here, when the page first loads up in the first game, the speed is going to be 1000 or 1 second. Inside this code here, which is about to be written by us, we're going to increase the speed, or sorry, decrease the delay or the speed here, which will then quicken up the game. So it's going to be calling this loop function a bit quicker. And that's how it's going to work. So if we now just console.log the drop count inside here, if I save this and go back in the browser, then I press any key on the keyboard, it's going to begin the game of 0, 1, 2, and that right there is our drop count. Now, as I showed you in the example, you may have noticed that essentially the enemies are only going to appear every second drop. So every even drop, we need to show an enemy. Okay, so let's do that right now. So if we go back inside the code right here, we can check for the evenness of this number. So if it's an even number, let's make an enemy display. If it's an odd number, let's not make an enemy display. So going back inside here, we're going to check for that. So we'll say if the drop count, then we can say mod, then say 2. If the mod result of drop count mod 2 is equal to 0, you've got an even number. So we'll say even number, or even drop count, add new enemy. Okay. For this, we'll simply now generate a random number between 0 and 2. So we'll say const position is equal to math.floor, then say math.random multiplied by 3. So just calling that right there. So now this position is going to be either 0, 1, or 2. And that right there is your array indexes for the enemy cells. So we'll say enemy cells at index of position is equal, dot inner HTML is equal to, then passing through here a new div with a class of enemy. Okay, so now it's going to give us a new enemy between these positions of 0, 1, or 2. I can save this, go back in the browser, press any key on the keyboard, start the game, an enemy appears right there. Now it is running. It's eventually gonna, cover all 3, but we can see there, if I just refresh again, press any key, we now get that one, then we get that one, and every second it's gonna pick a new random number. Okay, so that is your enemies appearing. Now they don't currently move down the grid. So to achieve that, let's go back inside here. We're gonna be looping over all of the enemy cells backwards. Okay, now the reason why it needs to go backwards is because we need to first shift everything down and then add in a new enemy on the top row. So for that, we can say for let I equal to, then say enemy cells dot length -1. So remember, this enemy cells is actually going to be 30 because there's 30 enemy cells. So this just means basically I equal to 29. Obviously, by using the length, it's going to be a bit more reusable. So I is going to be equal to 29 when the loop first starts up. We're going to go backwards, which means we can now just say, as long as I is more than or equal to 0, we're good to go. Then we can just say I minus. So now it's going to go from 29 and loop downwards till it reaches, 0. Okay. So now, once we're inside this loop, we can now say const cell is going to be equal to enemy cells at index I. So this cell right here, when the loop first runs for index 29, the cell is going to simply just mean this 29th cell right down here. Okay, that physical div. Okay. Then we can just say const the next cell. So this just means where we want the enemy to appear next. So if, for example, you are on, the first cell, it's going to be index 0. Okay, so I is going to be equal to 0. If we add 3 to the I, we get 4. So we get 3. My mistake. So 0 plus 3 is going to be equal to 3. It's going to go 0, 1, 2, and then 3 for the 4th cell. Okay, so that is going to be how we discover our next cell. So back inside here, we'll say next cell equal to cell, so all the cells. Then we can say at index I plus 3. It's important that it's all the cells because the next cell could be one of the player cells. So make sure you have cells here and not enemy cells. Okay. We can now say const enemy is equal to, then just say cell.children at index 0. So this enemy here is simply going to refer to your div with a class of enemy. So one of these right here. Now, we're looping through every single one of our 29 cells. Not all of them are going to have an enemy inside there. In fact, most of them won't have. So for those ones, going back inside here, we'll just say if there is no enemy inside this cell, then we don't need to move anything down. There's no collision checking. We can simply just continue and move on. So we'll say continue here to move on to the next cell to loop over. Okay. So how do we move everything down? Very easy. We'll just say next cell dot append child, then append the enemy. So grabbing that next cell and just moving the enemy from the previous one into the next one. Okay, cool. So if I save this and go back in the browser, press any key, it's going to appear there, then continue drop down. Because our code from earlier is still running, it's still going to be adding in the new cells every second, cell, it's going to work. So we can see that it actually gets stuck at the bottom because we're yet to, write some code to prevent that or finish the game. So we'll fix that right now, but we can see it's working right there. Okay, so going back inside the text editor, I'll just refresh the page here to clear the board. There we go. So going back inside the text editor, we can now check for a collision. So for this, we can say if the player cells dot includes the next cell. So we're saying here, okay, is the next cell one of our player cells? Okay, if that's the case, we have to check for a couple of things. Well, one thing, a collision. So for this, we'll say if the next cell dot query selector, and we look for a player. So the next cell here, if for example, we go back inside here, if the enemy is currently in this position right there in the center, the next cell is going to be this one. So this one right here. We're checking if the next cell contains an element with a class of player. If it does, there's a collision. Okay, so we'll say here, let's stop the game. Stop game equal to true. Let's not continue anymore. Okay. Otherwise, if we're good to go, if we missed it, if the next cell is one of these ones on the left side or on the right side or vice versa, we can actually grant a point. So we'll say here, score plus plus. Let's add 1 to the score. Okay. We can also increase the speed of the game. So we'll say speed is going to be equal to, then we can just say speed minus 25 milliseconds. Now, the problem here is eventually you get to a negative speed or 0 speed. So to prevent that, we can just say math.max, then say 25, and then just say speed minus 25. My mistake, this needs to be something like 100. So this is basically just going to be your absolute fastest speed of the game, 100 milliseconds on that loop, okay? So if this speed happens to be something like negative 450 or something like that, this 100 is always going to be the max of these two values, therefore it's going to choose 100 as the minimum. So we can't go negative. So having that speed right there is going to make that work. Then we can just say score display dot inner HTML equal to the new score. So just updating the HTML strong tag with the new score. And then lastly below here, we can just say enemy dot remove just to remove that enemy, that red circle from the document. Okay, so now if I save this and just go back in the browser, we're almost done. So we can see here, the enemies are going to drop down, and as we continue to play the game, if we have that next cell, boom, we're good. It cleared it, the score increases, and our milliseconds, our speed is also decreasing, which is going to, of course, increase the speed of the game. We can see here, things are getting progressively faster. Now, if I was to, of course, fail the game right here, something like this, what happens? Well, of course, we get the alerts right there. I press OK and everything gets reset. So that is basically all when it comes to building up this avoider game using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. All right, so thanks for watching, guys. Hope this video helped you out. If it did, drop a like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.